Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to our next of our webinar series. You know, this one here is going to be kind of tie some things together. You know, we've the last 4 or 5, 3 or 4 of them that we've done, we've talked about, what do you do in 10 minutes? What do you do in 20? What do you do when you're in a cart and you go to download your data? And all of these are on purpose, and we're doing, we're going to continue to do even a couple more. That we're going to have one that on in a week or a little over a week about motorcycles and road racing motorcycles. We're going to have one on dirt ovals and a mini sprint, and we'll have more, right, of tying this all together and into you've downloaded your data, now what kind of a thing, instead of talking about functionality of how to create or read a channels report or a split report or a track report, or how to change colors in the graphs, or change your backgrounds. All those things are all very valuable, and we've done some of those, and we'll probably continue as we get more questions. But we're rolling this farther and farther down the loop here, and we're just building more and more of these, where now we're in a time frame now where we're going to talk about data analysis, and then bringing in folks like James today, and Peter and Matt and Eric and others that will look at the process they do to follow when they're doing their data analysis. So this is so valuable, and I'm just so pleased that we have such great co-hosts that come in and do these things. So thank you all for being here. We're going to talk about end of day data analysis today, and see some different functionality and the thought process that James goes through as he's understanding and looking at his data. I know there are things that you're going to be able to take away from this and incorporate into your data analysis as well. A couple things as we get started, as we always do. Make sure you turn on your question and answer box. Having that up there, those to type into that is what a question that you think fits into this particular topic of today's, and you want James or I to try to answer it. Go ahead and stick that into the question and answer box. There's a chat box that's there as well. I know all of you, I see tons of you are clicking in there and chatting away. Thank you all for that. On that chat box, it zooms a little bit funny that way. Down at the bottom, it's by default, it only sends your chats to the panelists, myself, James, and our able staff from AIM that are in the background watching and answering some of your questions. Make sure you hit that little pull down arrow next to where it says all panelists, and change that to all panelists and attendees. That way everybody can see what you type into the chat. So that's a helpful little thing. So keep that in mind. We're going to do some polls as usual, and I'm going to turn this over fairly quickly to James and have him start the process. But I want to introduce James quickly and talk a little bit about him, and run one poll before we actually get to chatting. James has been working with us. I think this is his 4th co-host role here at the AIM LearnFast webinars of 2020, and great guy. I've known him for, gosh, 10, 15 years or something like that, since he was living in my area and racing locally with here in the Seattle area, and got to know him back then. Came to a couple of our on-site seminars, and always a super smart guy, and asking lots of great questions, and has really taken his data acquisition game to another level. So love that he's here and doing all of that. James, do a little bit more of a self-introduction, and then I'll take it back. We'll do a little bit of some polling and stuff, and then hand it over to you to talk about what do you do at the end of the day with data acquisition.
Sure. Hello again, everybody. Lovely to be here presenting. I think Roger covered most of what happens. I'm a club racer at heart. Racing is a passion for me. It is my release, and it is my opportunity to have fun and not think about work, which is lovely. It's interesting that I've been racing for a decade or more now. In my day job, I look at data and data analysis, and so it didn't take long to be able to connect the dots in terms of how to work on this. And it's interesting that the biggest learning that I've had, apart from, I'm just like all of you, I've learned tons through these seminars and webinars, which has been brilliant, is also the sim racing side as well, because things that, it's like if only I had a session that I could play with that data. Oh, hold on 5 minutes, log on to iRacing, knock out a session, bring that data in, and start working with a different variable and a different track. And so there's been a lot lately that is sort of fast forwarded, but it's just lovely to be here and nice to talk to all of you.
Perfect, and we appreciate all the hard work you put into to setting these up. As you mentioned, yeah, I have learned something from almost every webinar that we've given, and I've learned the most when I actually am presenting, in preparation of that. And you learn a little things more about the software, even though it's something that I work inside of every day. So it's just being here and doing these things, we all just continue to learn, and I think that's great. As Robbie is known to do, there's Robbie with some posts in some links in the chat box. I appreciate that. There's James's website that you can go to. Then he's got also has a bunch of links. He also has a bunch of YouTube videos that we'll probably link up to in a little bit, where he's a bunch of these, as it says in the screen there, producer of aimsports how-to videos since 2012, and he's got a bunch of those as well that are very valuable. So take a look at those. Let's start with our first poll today, and it's let's see, continue to allow. Yep, there we go. You should see a poll that is going to chat about what hardware do you own. It's one of those things that we just like to get a decent handle of who's here. What kind of hardware are you using? It helps us for the next week's worth of these webinars. So love it if you'd plug in there if you have any of the AIM hardware. What are you using? And if it's not on the list, there's another category down there below. It shares with SmartyCam, but it's got another category. If it's other that you're selecting that one for, just plug in the other equals into the chat box. That will help us understand the end result of that as well. So I'm gonna we'll let that go for just another few seconds. And then we'll get ready to go. There's going to be James's first slide in a second. Let's go ahead and we're going to end this in just about 5 seconds. If you haven't done your polling, go ahead and finish up real quickly. Let's end the polling. Perfect. I appreciate everybody doing that. And one of the things that we've been, again, I mentioned a little bit earlier, we've been talking about what do you do in 10 minutes? What do you do in 20 minutes? Just trying to give you an idea of, boy, what do you do right when you get out of the car? You're still hot and sweaty, you've got your water, but sometimes you don't have a ton of time, or there are certain things that you're in the heat of the battle. And then, so we want to do this end of the day kind of a data analysis. It's a technique that I've used when we were using data in the field in a heavy way. And I would always look at the data real quickly, and then we would take a look at it later. Typically, I would look at data 3 times. I would look at it as like we got out of the car, look, vehicle health things, little things I could help the driver with real quickly. See if there's something, is the car understeering, oversteering, to take the feedback of the driver and try to quantify it better. Then, of course, what we should be doing is what James is going to talk about today, which is, looking at the end of the day, okay, you've got your 4 or 5 sessions, you've taken a look at some things. Let's sit down and bring it all together. And then I often would look at the data one more time, and it might be Wednesday, Thursday, back at the shop, back at home, where we've had a little bit of time to think about it, get away from the heat of the battle, and then say, okay, well, we're thinking about changing that sway bar, right? Let's dig in even deeper and look at when I went from the sway bar was full soft to medium to full hard. Is what I'm thinking about doing, does it really show in the data, and really focus in on certain things, right? So that's what we're going to talk about today, and going to hand it over to James. We're going to walk through a couple of slides, and then we're going to share his screen and look at some actual data. So first off, I've got a couple slides here. You're going to kind of introduce the topic, James. What do you have in mind? Questions that you need in mind for your end of day data analysis?
Yeah. So if somebody asked me, what's if you had 10 minutes at the track between sessions, and sometimes you don't get much time. When I used to run in the US, we'd run multiple run groups, and so you don't get a huge amount of time between sessions. Which I would always look at a SmartyCam. So in all the cars that I've had, I've been lucky enough to have the SmartyCam, where I'd have you could see my inputs and you could also see my feet inputs, which were fantastic. And so, I'd know at the tracks and the car, because I was relatively comfortable at that point with my own car and everything that was there, that you're hesitant on the brake here, you're not going to 100% throttle, you're stabbing at the pedals, and it would just help me understand what I was doing, and that would be the fastest thing that I would use. And then what would happen, and it varies depending on where you are, but typically when I was in the US, race weekends would be weekends, or they would be over multiple days. So, you may have a test day on a Friday, qualifying and maybe a race on Saturday, and then feature race or end of race on Sunday, which gives you time in between to be able to sit and have a look at data in a lot more detail. In the UK, it's often very different now, and it's one of the big learnings is that you turn up at the track, your first session is qualifying, then you race and go home. And it's all in one day. And so it changes the dynamic of what you do in terms of looking at data, but it's still the same sort of concept. So these are the questions that I have in mind. The first one's a little bit of a joke, but it's not, because it's arguably, you've got more time, you've got time to relax and to look through things. The reason I mentioned cup of coffee is it relates to the 7th point as well, which is the number of times that I would leave the track. I'd go for dinner with the team. Because it was a team of 10 people, it would take ages to get a table. You'd have your dinner, you'd get back to your hotel room, and the last thing you'd want to do is open up your laptop and have a look at data. And so morning would always be a better time. So if you could get up early in the morning when you're fresh and wanted to be able to have a look at it, that might be a better time to be able to look at it, because at the same time, I think, however you comprehend data, it's important. That said, there are people, Ross Bentley was always very famous saying, sleep on something and then you'll do it better the next day. Maybe looking at it the night before, but it's generally when you have more time to look. So that's the first thing. The next thing is what happened today or yesterday. I won't do this through all of them, but yesterday is if you've woken up the next day. So what actually happened? Note taking is probably the most important thing to be able to do. People think that, you can sit there with the register and write, a 1,000-word essay on how well I did today, and this is where I should look. It's not like that. It's key notes that are important to you as you think about certain areas of performance, which I think is there. So what actually happened? Did you take the notes? Other key variables to think about before you get into it. Have you raced here before? If so, what do your previous notes and analysis say? And so that's kind of key. That's really important, because I don't know about you, but I can barely ever remember what happened yesterday, maybe because I take point number 1 too seriously. But at the same time, in general, I need to have a visual reference. So it's like, okay, well, what was the weather like? What did I do? What was the tire condition? Et cetera, et cetera. And I can log that and have a look at if there's something that I can rinse and repeat if I'm not finding what I'm looking for the next time that I'm there. Then the next thing, it sounds like the craziest question of all. What do I like to achieve tomorrow? Well, we're all racing drivers. So tomorrow I'd like to win the race. Well, why wouldn't we? But at the same time, there are things that you can break that down. I'd like to be more consistent. I'm really struggling to be able to get through 4 or 3. And so it's really important that you identify a few things to be able to work on, to be able to look through. And then the next thing is to be able to identify how will the data help you address that plan. Because a data is a tool. It's like you don't turn to a screwdriver or a drill and say, what hole should I drill in the wall? More so, you know what you want to do, and then you grab the tool for that. And it's the same thing you have to think about with data. Data is a means to helping you understand something that you're trying to achieve. And so make sure you've got a plan in mind when you're looking at that data. And then the last point to be able to move forward is, as said, are you alert enough to be able to look through this and make sure you give it enough time to be able to look through, because I think it's important that discovery of certain key trends is there. So that's the first thing I want to be able to have a look at. The next slide, which Roger, I know you've got control.
There you go. There you go.
Is that I am relatively quite a note taker. I'll show another one later on as it relates to the sessions I'm going to look through, but this was one I've got these all the way back to 2012. Varying conditions of notes depending on how serious I was taking the sort of session. But this was an SCCA major at the time. We were looking at being able to make it through to the runoffs, and so looking at certain variables. And so yeah, we taking notes. But the one thing to be able to note in here is shocks, other people's shock settings that are there. And it's interesting if you look down in the bullets, which may be hard to see. Saturday race seemed to be lifting a wheel and losing time in fast right-hand corners. So you're like, okay, well, it's interesting how we found that out, actually. It wasn't necessarily in the data. It was from a photograph. And so I had a friend of mine who was taking photographs at the track. And interestingly, one of the photographs showed the wheel slightly off the, and they were like, well, that doesn't look very good. I mean, I'm not getting the best traction out of that, especially if you're trying to turn right and one of the wheels is in the air. So again, it just gives you an idea of the value of notes. And yes, for the comments there, OneNote is my preferred choice, and it's a very simple reason. I have it on my phone. And so when I'm at my PC, I can doodle and make all sorts of notes. But you'll probably notice in the right-hand side, I've got schedule, regulations, and a few things that I just download and throw in there before the weekend. So I know where I need to be. Also, equally important, if I choose to do the next morning analysis, when do I need to be at the track? If my first session is not until 10:30, that means that I've got enough time in the morning to be able to look at data. If my first session is 7:30 or 8 o'clock, the first session out, probably don't. And it changes the variable as to where I actually spend the time to look at the data. And so that's key. I think we'll go into a demo, but Roger, probably the next poll might be applicable at this point, I'm guessing.
And I
no, that's okay. We can do this one as well. So what I wanted to be able to look at today is 3 areas. Someone mentioned in last survey, you're going to talk about vehicle health. We'll have a look at that in a little bit more detail as part of this. So the 3 areas to be able to look at are driver performance. How can you make developments in your driving? Could be anything, braking, cornering, gear changes. We actually talk about gear changes quite a lot, an interesting one there. Then there's consistency. And then I wrote it 3 times because just bolding it wasn't important enough. But, looking at the consistency of performance is really key. And then just looking at areas of focus to fix for the next day or the next time. And I think it's important to be able to always have that reference. Some tracks like nowadays feels like, a history lesson. But what I do today is generate the same track, and then we mix it up with a few others, but I'm running a championship at one track. And so there's a relative element of consistency. But some tracks, when I was in the US, I would go to once a year. And so if you didn't leave fresh in your mind with notes as to what you wanted to do the next time, you would forget them. And I think that that's kind of key. So that's something we'll look at. The next we'll look at is vehicle health, RPM, temperatures, pressures, look at all sorts of different variables there. And then the last thing, and this is kind of key, how many times, if you've got a system that's got an alarm, do you get in the car and go out for a session and that alarm comes on again? You're like, I really wish I changed that bloody alarm because it's come on again, and it just happens to be distracting. Simple things like that, either not addressed and the alarm said it is set wrong, or other variables such as, okay, well, hold on a second, I need to do something about this alarm the next time so it doesn't come on, is kind of key. So just making sure you work through the configuration as well is also key. So we'll look at that. And so that's what we're going to have a look at in the demo today. Roger, I think we should...
Perfect. A couple things that I just would add to this. I love that the notes are such an important thing. And what it really... there are a number of good reasons for it, but the one that I really enjoy is when you go back to that track the next time, you are starting at a certain level. And if you don't do your notes and you don't think about the last time you were there, you have to start over. And practice 1 and practice 2 is nothing more than catching up with where you were before. And you can, with track time being so valuable, not only financially, but bigger piece as the time, the ability to get the most out of these early practices is just critical to success. So I love that you do that. The next thing I want to do is I want to launch another poll that's tied together a little bit to what we're chatting about here, obviously. But, and what it is what do you look at data at the end of the day? Let's say that you're going to watch what we're talking about here today and what James is sharing, and then many of you maybe are already doing it, but what are you taking a look for? What do you look for at the end of the day? Pick as many as you want. It's multiple choice. Specific issues you want to understand. That thing that we share a lot here, which is the data analysis triangle: vehicle health, I'm sorry, driver performance, vehicle health, right? Which is really what his notes that we're looking at on the screen here are really all about. Curiosity, you're gonna go, it's gonna go dig around a little bit. Areas for improvement, you know that the car is, or you're fighting turn 3, hey, let's just jump into that area, and the rest of the choices that you've got there. You've also got an other box there, if and please add to the chat box if it's other that we maybe didn't cover something that you want to mention. So we'll let that run for about another minute. James, you have a little bit to add to that poll or this screen as we let everybody kind of finish up, and then we'll move on?
No. I mean, I think that there's a number of reasons why people do look at data, and I think that all of the answers here, including the entertainment and passing the time, is a legit, even though desperately unpopular answer. Is in general. It varies depending on what you're looking for, but sometimes you don't know what you don't know until you see it. And then there's an aha moment and you find it. And I think there's a lot to do with that. Similarly, there's, you know what, I'm really struggling here. And that's where somebody else's data becomes quite useful to be able to understand. Just don't understand, why are they pulling away from me here? Why am I losing time? So all of these are legit answers. And I think that it'd be interesting to see what folks say.
Well, here we go. Let's end the polling. It looks like, for the most part, it's slowed down on the numbers. We'll end the polling now, and let's share the results. Let's share the results of what everybody was kind of thinking. The number one area is looking for areas of improvement in a particular part of the track, right? So that you've been out there driving in the heat of the moment. You tried maybe on your quick downloads, or you looked at some video or something, but now you really want to study turn 3, because it just seems like on entry, when you're around other cars, they're just kicking your tail as you enter the corner, whatever happens to be. That one was 81% of the people. That's a big piece of what they do. The next one is comparing my performance with last time I was at this track. So using your own data to compare, a very powerful tool, obviously. The next one was specific issues you wanted to understand, the driver or the car, or whatever it is, and that was 64%. Those two were pretty darn close. And then the next one, comparing my performance with another data point, friend, co-driver, right there. And then the one that's curiosity, just you're going to sit down and look, that was 32%. So and like you mentioned, I'm looking for entertainment, I'm passing my time, had exactly 0%. People said that's why they look at their data. So fun to look at nonetheless. So I'm going to stop sharing those results, and then what I think let me make sure, let's go to my next slide. That's what I thought. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to turn it over to James. We're going to share his computer here in a moment. Go ahead and share yours, James. And as I look around, we'll have one more poll towards the end. James is going to share his screen, and there we go. We see it. He's got Race Studio up and running. So James, let's walk through the process of what you do. At the end of the day, you've done your short ones, you've had your beer or your coffee, and as you had in your other list, and then hey, what are we going to take a look at first?
Absolutely. So what I wanted to look at was a series of different aspects of data analysis. And this was at the Walter Hayes Trophy race, my first ever one, first season in a Formula Ford car. So tons to learn as we went through. And I wanted to be able to demonstrate sort of a few things. So the first thing I want to be able to have a look at is I'm going to do am I getting better on the track analysis? And by doing that, this was session 1, session 2, session 3. Session 1, session 2, session 3. And I can open those tests to see if things are actually progressing well on the track. Now, I do love this luminous green. Let me just change that to something that's slightly less bright, let's put it that way. And the first thing we want to be able to have a look at is, what was getting better? Where was I improving? Did it match some of the aspects of what I was thinking about in terms of notes? And if you think about the note aspect, one of the things that we can obviously look in terms of starting off with is blue is the fastest lap, red is the second fastest lap, and green is the slowest lap. And interestingly, session 1, session 2, session 3. So there were improvements. One of the areas of being able to look, and this is something that I probably looked at as we looked through data, and you'll notice it in my notes, is that this were the notes that I actually took during the session that were there. And, there may have been few sort of aspects of things that I would be looking for. in the dry, use all the road and carry even more speed through cops, which was turn 1. So if you know, I'm taking notes through the session, this is exactly where that is on the track. And so these are things that I started to work on. So the first thing I'm looking at is, are things progressing? Am I doing things relatively consistently? And am I doing, you know, am I doing okay? And I think that there were some things that I did better than others and some things that were slightly inconsistent. The blue line in this was the fastest. And we'll look at consistency, because obviously we all know that one lap comparisons aren't always going to give you exactly what you need, because there could have been something that happened somewhere on track. And I think someone mentioned earlier the excuse t-shirt. I'm still having that made. I can't find one that's big enough to cover all of the excuses that I want to put on, but I might have a series of those, one for every day of the week. But in essence, what we're looking at here is you know, the starting platform. Are things getting better? Am I starting to work on certain areas? So that's the first, simple analysis. Now I've got a few aspects of profiles that I've set up here. This is the GPS basic. This is my probably fastest, quickest go-to if I was looking at data in the 10 minutes that I was at the track. But now I've got a bit more time, I want to be able to have a look at a little bit more as I go through. And so I'm going to start looking at some interesting other sort of aspects of this. So I'm going to scroll down here and I'm going to click on GPS Advanced. Now this one, Roger and I were talking about how easy it is to be able to click on the red X there. But if I click on this one, now I'm going to get a slightly different view that's going to give me all sorts of new data points that I can start looking at to understand why and what I may have been doing differently as I went session to session, to be able to start looking at additional variables. Now this is, I'm going to get rid of this just for a second, so I've got a little bit more screen real estate. Spacebar, by the way, I'm sure everyone on this call knows, but the one question I always get is, how did you just do that? Well, I hit and it's oftentimes a top question that we get asked. On here, just for anyone who's got a solo, this is exactly what you can get in terms of analysis with an AIM solo. You'll see later through this, and I've referenced this in previous seminars, that it was quite handy that we were doing GPS only, because I actually had to swap cars halfway through the event. Was what am I doing better in terms of sort of looking at this? Now it's a bit clumsy on here, so I'm actually going to get rid of one of the sessions to make life a little bit easier to be able to see. And I think I'm going to get rid of, let's get rid of the middle one, because then we can see the biggest delta through the day between the 3 sessions. And so now we can start seeing what's being done better. And you can see straight away that some of the key areas and corners, actually the latter half, the back half of the track, I'm not really, you know, focusing there. We talked about it last time round, which is if it's okay, you know, don't necessarily work on it. Or start looking at that later and fine tune after you've taken away the huge chunks of time gain as we look through it. And one of the biggest areas that I found, and it's one of the biggest sort of bravery corners I think in the world, is Copse Corner at Silverstone. And you know, that is turn 1 at Silverstone National. And so you can see that as I progressed through, I was carrying more speed. And so that's helping me identify, was I start working on key aspects. And so I'm relatively comfortable with saying, okay, I'm doing things better, but I'm not over the moon with my braking. It's a little bit better. This is the GPS inverse longitudinal here, which kind of mimics a brake trace. A brake trace would be nicer if you're lucky enough to have it, but this mimics it if you don't. And what you want to be able to see is brakes and then trailing off slowly. And so these bits here, they're okay. But this is still braking, more braking. And that was at the beginning of the session. And this sort of improves here as well. So some nice aspects of what we're looking at here. The other thing which I also like is confidence in the car. And so you can see that not only here have I started to brake later, that I'm actually braking harder. And this is a representation of the sharpest. This is thanks to Jeremy Lucas. I said to Roger earlier, I'm a bit of a magpie with the analysis here. I'll just say, oh, thanks very much. I'll take that and apply it to my learning. And so that's been a huge part of this in terms of what's going on. And so I've loved that. So these are some of the things, but again, 1 lap analysis, all very useful. But one of the things that I've thrown in here, and again, thanks to others on this particular event, is that I've added in a channels report. And on the channels report, I've added in some additional variables that allow me to be able to look at sessions and see what happened within these sessions to see improvement that were there. Now, one of the things that I like to be able to look at here, thanks to the analysis. And I used some of this. We raced for the first time in the UK on the 4th of July. It was nice to be able to get back at the track. So I've used some of this more recently in terms of looking at some key variables that we could work on and some that we may not need to. So bottom session is the first session, top session is the faster of the three. And the one thing I love, and last time Jonathan Goring, and I've got his quote here, it's from his website. It says, it's not how fast you go, but how little you slow. It's a great quote that if I look at some of the math channels that I've added in here, which look at the amount of time that I'm on the brake pedal, it just so happens that the fastest lap that I had was also the lap that I was on the brake the least amount of time. And you can see that right here. This shows that the fastest lap that I had, a 1:05.0, which is still way off what the faster guys were doing, but still a development for me in terms of working on certain aspects. And it was improving throughout the entire session, as you can see, is, you know, the use of the brake was less. And I think that that's an important variable to be able to have a look. Things that I want to be able to work on as I look at consistency through here, and we're going to have a look at consistency in one of the sessions a bit later as we go through, is other aspects of this sort of piece is, oh, hold on a second, there's a little bit of coasting going on here. And you can see that if we're not braking, we're not accelerating, and we're not cornering, then we're coasting. And there's still a bit of coasting that needs to be sort of remedied and rectified as part of that overall sort of model that's here, and probably coasting more in the faster of the sessions than I was as I was figuring out at the beginning session. And so a lot of useful information to be able to sort of apply here. The last one I like on this one is actually this aspect here, the GPS speed in terms of average. It sounds like the craziest thing to say, but the faster your average speed, the faster your lap time. And you often see it on your timing and scoring results. This was what my average speed was. But interestingly, it wasn't necessarily the fastest lap in terms of top speed. And so being able to have an average there also helps get an understanding of where that's working through. So this is the first sort of area of being able to look at progression. I would have probably done this channel's report on all three sessions to be able to start picking out certain aspects of what I want to be able to work on, and then start being able to look at which lap I did it in to be able to analyze that. But we can look at that in a slightly different way by saying, okay, well, let's say that the first session was a let's figure it out session. And you know, just like Roger said, you know, you can continue your momentum from the last time you were somewhere, but this was my first ever Walter Hayes. And so a lot of this stuff is new. I'll carry this for next year. This year, sorry, it was last year this race was, but interesting to have a look at. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to close out. I'm going to pick just the one with the fastest session. The reason I'm going to pick that is if you can see it here, I go to lap manager. One of the things that's interesting here is that a little bit consistency there. I would say that, you know, each lap was pretty close to the other lap. And you can see that here in terms of this reference. If it's got 100 there and it's not 101 or 102, they're quite close together. Now, you may be thinking, oh, that's great. Well, however, if the fastest person on the track is doing 104, it's exactly the same as that. And all of a sudden, I've got myself stuck in a rut. And, you know, I want to be able to look at certain variables. That's where we're going to start looking at other driver information will help us with that. But the other thing I want to be able to have a look at is that happening in different points on the track, and am I being consistent? And so one of the things that many of you have seen me do this before, it's my favorite thing to be able to do is I'm going to go to laps. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick my fastest laps. So there's one there. It's funny when you do this, I was so smooth when I was practicing on it. That one, that one, that one. And when you're on a screen, you're like, hold on, is it that
while you're picking those, I did see a question go by that I thought would be great to share. We do share the maths and the math channels and the profiles and even the data for almost every webinar we've done. If you go back within a day or so, it's not there when we first put it up there, obviously, but if you hit the description box and there's a show more button, if you go in there, today's will be the same way. We'll have the data that we're looking at, the math channels that are part of this that you can import, and the profiles that James has created here. All those will be available for you to download and take a look at it. And if you think that there's some previous webinars we've done in the past, those that same information is available as well, including on James's, because we had some slides in the presentation. Well, actually, the presentation will be there as well as in a PDF. Another question that came up really quickly while we were rolling was the note taking. How to, and it's still there from Grant. How do you take notes? iPad, transfer them straight to the laptop. He mentioned that real briefly. He does it on his phone, and he uses quick OneNote, right? OneNote,
Yep.
and because he's got it where it's synced between his phone and his computer. Note taking is a personal thing. Whatever works for you. Maybe it's a piece of paper, maybe it's a whiteboard in your trailer, whatever. But James does it electronically on his phone. That's his best place. So, okay, James, head
Yeah.
back in now that you got your laps all stacked up.
Yeah. So again, right now it's sort of like, that looks nice. I can't tell a thing from this. I don't know about you. So what I generally do is I want to be able to show that if you start selecting a lot of laps, typically you need to be able to adjust those. So I wanted to be able to see that, this is my fastest lap, but I want to see consistency. Generally what I do is I go in and I change these colors.
This is a great tip. This is one I learned as you continue on, but this is one that I learned that was very powerful to me when I saw you doing it and something I had not done. Perfect tip.
So, thank you, Roger. And so there's that, and you may notice that the blue lap's at the back. And if we go in here and we just turn that reference lap off, and then we turn it back on again, it will now be the last one that's been enabled, and it will show up over the top. Now, if I close down, I can start looking at areas of what Roger taught us as noise, which is where the lines are very close together, that's consistent. Where the lines are far apart, that's inconsistent. And that's areas where you may be able to work on. And this is where we start thinking about consistency and being able to see, are we doing something different? Are we doing something well or not so well? And this is where your excuse engine starts. But in many respects, there's a lot of things that I think that the blue lap here has done well. We can see here that it's taken the first corner particularly well and taken more speed through there. And you can see that there's a relatively nice in terms of throttle application that is here. This is a little bump, that may be hesitation, that may also been like, oh, lift, go. Who knows, but there's still throttle that's coming in there. And again, this is GPS based, nice amount of braking that comes through that corner, and then acceleration coming out of the corner is okay, but there's still a lift. There's still a lift. That could be a confidence lift, as Peter Krause often refers to them. And so again, something to work on, but it still allows me to carry that speed all the way down the straightaway. And so look what happens against all the other laps. That's a nice variable to be able to have a look at.
Beautiful, beautiful.
And so that's great. But interestingly, maybe carrying that extra speed made me think, ooh, as I came up to this corner, and if anyone wants to think what that corner looks like, and we can look at that in another view, I may have sort of slowed sooner, and you can see that the brake on trace shows the brake application is sooner than any of the others. And interestingly, also not quite as hard a brake as well. So it was sort of, okay, I need to slow down, but at the same time, lost speed against all those other laps that are there. So that could be an area of improvement, because what you want to do is if I've done 105s, 105, 105, 105, 105, then where can I break the segment? Where can I break the segment? Where can I break the track into segments and say, you did that bit well and that bit well? And if you glued those all together and did the same thing every time round, your consistency may also reward you with a faster lap time. And I'll show you that in two views that we have here. You may have noticed that I've already started a little bit up here, and we can look at that in two ways. So there's a few things on here that allow us to be able to have a look at. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, hold on, how do you know what you're doing over here? Again, the simplest thing is if you click in the area where those reference points are, it'll move them to the other side so you can see what you're doing on the other side of the graph. I think everyone's probably figured that one out by now. But also we've got some inconsistency here as we look at the brake coming into this corner, whereas the lap here has done a particularly nice job of being able to brake and then, get back on the accelerator for, the very small straight that's there. So, that's not too bad. This, I'd probably want to clean up a little bit that's here. It's just inconsistent and noisy and just, a bit of a mess as we look at it. So, there's a few things that we want to be able to have a look at here, and I would say, okay, that's finding consistency. But my favorite way of finding consistency is through the split times report. You can figure it out here, but there's another way of being able to do it, which is to break the track into segments. And what I've got here is if I open up the track map that's here, you can see these are the areas where it's focused on This is straight, straight, right hand, and so forth, all the way around the track. Left hand. Interestingly, only one left-hander. Never realized that until now. Funny, I've driven this track quite a lot now. Maybe I'm not driving it right. But you only really, it's like if you're a line rock, there's only one left-hand turn, I think. And so you're like, oh, okay, yeah. But interesting when you think about setup, do you set it up for right-hand corner or left-hand corners? I think that's self-explanatory. But interestingly, I can now break it down into segments and say, okay, so what have I done well here? And I could open up another session and be able to say, well, there's so much inconsistency here that there's areas of opportunity. If I cleaned up that and I cleaned up this and I took each of these segments, not one of these laps, interestingly, the fast lap has only got 3 of the fastest segments. But what if I took all of those perfect areas and then mapped them out? Now I'm looking at 104s. And you're like, ooh, that's interesting. Because remember, we're talking tenths here because we're all racers. We're not looking for seconds. Well, not straight out of the gate anyway. And so, you know, this is an area to be able to start looking at it. Now, some of you may say, okay, well, hold on a second. That's a little bit, how do you know what you did in 1 and 2 and 3? And that's why I've got it mapped this way, because you ignore the green bits necessarily, because they're sort of outcomes when you're going straight of how well you did in the corners. And so it's figuring out what you did in the corners and being able to find consistency. And now when you look at it, okay, lap 1, corner 1 was done on lap 6. Corner 2 was done on, lap, 6 as well, which is good. Lap 3 wasn't though, that was done on lap 9. And this corner 4 was done on lap 11. So, okay, well, let's have a look at what's happening there. And so we've got 2 options here. The first, and we're going to pick on corner number 1 because we've already talked about this a little bit, which is the most amount of speed was taken through corner 1, which was one of the indicators. And we've talked about it all along. It's a confidence corner. And so if you can carry a lot of speed through that corner, but the question is why? Is it confidence? Clearly. But at the same time, is there other reasons? So there's 2 ways I'd like to look at that, which it could be line. So the first thing we can do, seeing as we've still got these highlighted, is that we can have a look. I'm going to get rid of this so it's nice and easy for everyone to see. And we can have a little zoom in here and we can say, what did the blue lap do that the others didn't? And what was their line look like? And you can see, whoa, that looks like a nice line through there. But hold on a second. Is that a nice line? Who knows? Well, there's an easy way of being able to figure that one out by taking the same laps, and it's almost like I rehearsed this. I took the same laps and I put them onto Google Earth. And I took all the other laps and I made them gray. Now, interestingly, you can't highlight the fastest lap the same way you do in the AIM software. You have to do something slightly different. So I'll show you what that is. I've kept all of these laps at all 105s, but if you right click in them and go into properties, not only did I change the color here and I picked a color, but what I also did is I changed the opacity here, or however you say that word. You'd think I'd have that one nailed in English, being English. But generally speaking here, you've got, I made it 20%, so it's faded in the background. So you could just see the slower laps that were there. And then I can zoom in and have a little look. I can get rid of that left hand. It's not the space bar, it's this button up here if you're using Google Earth. But now we can start having a look. And it's interesting, when I talk to some of my colleagues and fellow racers, I'm still not doing as well as others were doing, that there's more road to be used out here to make the track even wider. But this is where it gets really interesting, which is using this part of the track and using a nice wide line, using some of the ROM. Don't go over here. That's 4 wheels off. That's not good. And so that actually happened here, which again, might have been fun at the time. But in general, you can see that this is a nice line that runs through that corner, and then it sort of creates a nice radius or an arc in that corner. So you can now see, okay, so let's replicate what we did there and carry that through as we move forward to every time we go through. And so if you don't have video, and interestingly, video will never give you this satellite view over the top, that it's a nice way of being able to have a look at some of that data. Again, and this is why the end of the day is perfect with this, because taking the time to put this data into Google Earth, to be able to click on them, to change the view, to select the colors, it just takes time. And this just gives you the opportunity of working through some of these variables as well. Now, that's some of the interesting sort of stuff we want to look at. But one of the things that we mentioned earlier was, how do we do against other drivers? So I'm going to go back and I'm going to go back into the race studio analysis. And I'm going to stop looking at my data and I'm going to start looking at other data points to see if there's things that I can learn from other drivers who might be willing to share their data with you, and vice versa, to be able to see if there's a communal. The one thing I love about racing, if you've got teammates or you've got people who you're really good friends with, is that you're here to race and have fun. And of course we want to win, but the last thing you want is to be, you know, so far behind that it's not fun to have a race. Racing is racing against people. So we find that there's more and more scenarios where people will happily share data if there's mutual learning from either direction. I think if you work with a pro, that's intellectual property and that's part of your relationship with them. And that's the way that I've always approached it. But if you're working in a team and friends, you can always learn tons from each other in terms of just sharing data, because not everyone's going to be perfect at every point on the lap. Well, ideally anyway, that's the case. So what we're going to do is we're going to keep that, we're going to close this session that's here, and we're going to open up two sessions that we're saying. So I've got another driver here who's driving same time, same session, and I'm going to open up that session there. Now, the first time I opened this up, I was almost tempted to do a GPS lap insert, which I ended up doing, because if I go to a simple analysis here, you'll notice that there's a lot of differences in terms of, I was like, oh, these seem a bit far off. I should, you know, maybe adjust these, but put a GPS lap insert, didn't necessarily change too much timing. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. You know, I'm blue and this other driver is red. So there's 3/10 in it. So where are they making that time? And so looking at this, there's loads that you could deduce from here. And, you know, we can look at, they're carrying more speed into the first corner. You know, while this is, you know, slowing down, they're also, you know, taking it through, but then losing it. And I was like, ooh, look at that, gain that time back. A little bit of a bump here because they got on the accelerator here and I did here. But what's going on here? This bit is the bit that I really wanted.
That's a big one, isn't it? That's a big
one. That's the one that's screaming, even with the simplest analysis that you have here. And I'm not even going to load up the more advanced stuff right now. I'm just going to show this, because what I also said, all right, well, let's have a look. So I use this handy dandy little function here called the delta function. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click it from here all the way down to the point of braking. And if I do that, that has said that you're losing just down that straightaway, best part of 3/10 of a second, or 0.276. So, huh, that's in a straight line. That's kind of unusual. And so I'm sure many people, when you're presenting your screen, you can't see what people are saying. It's slightly different. When you're watching, you can see what people say. And I'm sure some people are already starting to figure it out by now, that one of the biggest things that's happening here is, yes, they probably got on the accelerator sooner and could carry that speed, but these lines diverge over time. And you're like, okay, well, why is that? And it's this point here, this point here, and this point here. That also correlates to this point here, this point here, and this point here, which I'm sure many of you looked at, is gear change. This is a scenario whereby it's not, I mean, you can't call it free time, but it's straight line time, and it's the speed of gear change. And, you know, many of you who drive Formula Fords or have experience here know that depending on where you are, I was renting the car, I was using the clutch. It's not my car. I wanted to be, you know, the instruction from the person who owned the team was use the clutch. I wanted to use the clutch. I talked to other drivers. They're like, oh, no, it's a dog box. You could just bang it into the gear. And that may have been one of the big variables that changed the lap time here. So again, some things you can change. It's not like I'm going to start changing overnight. But you know, the interesting thing now is that I own my own Formula Ford. And so now I need to be able to start saying, okay, well, it's my gearbox now. Maybe I can start to grind the gears or get used to that sort of experience. Now, obviously, this is a really interesting sort of analysis, which, you know, take the time to be able to look at and compare data. This isn't a bravery thing. This isn't carrying more speed to something else. This is an input thing. And it's one of those things that I think oftentimes people don't value as much as they should do, which is even driving in a straight line. I mean, how many times, and I've probably said this in previous seminars, you look at someone and go, oh my God, they've got the biggest engine going. How are they pulling away from me? No, it's they're just driving in a straight line better than you are. And, you know, the old racer example, which is how it's very easy to drive in a straight line, just put your foot down. Well, you also have to change gear, and this is a variable. So
it's kind of funny, James, here on your particular example, you're the blue car, and right where you're coming exiting that corner, you actually do have virtually the same speed, if not a mile an hour better than the red driver. And then when you get to the end, your own data here is showing that he's 2 miles an hour faster, and it's just that. You even got out of the corner better. So number one. And number two, over there on the braking into turn one, you talked about that earlier, where the red line is shifted over. It's kind of cool that you've borrowed some data from somebody. He's nice enough to loan it to you, or you're a teammate or whatever. But he's 3/10 quicker. That turn one braking zone, and then the rolling through the middle, you have done some things there that are going to help him, right? Yes, he's helped you in a couple of spots here, but if he looks at this data and he works with you, and you share this information, he is entering that corner too fast, and it ends up costing him, probably, it looks to me like, just looking at the time compare bar, it's costing him 2 or 3/10 that he could be, both of you are going to move up in the order because of that particular spot. So all great stuff here. There you go. 20, almost 22, right? So there, you are helping him as well, and that's the power of data.
I totally agree with you, Roger, and I think that's one of the things that I've learned when I used to race a series called Pro 3 in the Pacific Northwest, which many of you may have heard of, or if you're in that region, and we created a data share. It was a Dropbox that people, if you contributed, you could take out, and we had some rules at the time, which were, after the weekend, just to make sure, there was some relative sort of, I figured something out and you haven't, and that might give me an advantage. But it was a really nice communal environment where I actually started doing a lot of my data analysis was with those sort of folks. And that's why the videos actually exist, was helping people figure the stuff out when they got home and wanted to look at the data. So I'm just always conscious of time and folks who, maybe in their lunch hour or wherever it is doing this. So again, great analysis to be able to have a look at here. But there's a few others that I wanted to be able to have a look at as we close out here, because then we want to start coming to some conclusions and being able to start making notes as to what we want to be able to do. Now, I'm going to close both of these sessions, and I'm going to look at the 3 here. Now, these 3 have partial Evo 4S installations, which is we didn't have throttle, but we did have oil pressure, engine temperature, and RPMs. One of the first things you're going to notice as well is that I've learned a lot through these, and a lot of colleagues, my sampling rates are slightly amiss on some of these analyses, but we wanted to have a little look at vehicle health. And the reason that we wanted to have a look at vehicle health is there's some things that you can learn through this analysis as well to be able to change sort of your approach. So I've got these 3 sessions open, and the first thing I'm going to have a look at is I want to be able to have a look at generally this is Formula Ford vehicle health. So I'm going to load it up, and it's going to do its thing. Hasn't changed the lovely luminous green yet, because we don't need to look at that. And what we've got here is we've got some aspects of information about the vehicle that are there. So we can see certain triggers that are available from the channel. Now, if you don't have these channels, one of the things that you may want to think about as you start thinking about, maybe I want some different types of setups, is this could be interesting to you. So I've actually created a trigger, even though it's not necessarily applicable, which is any time that the oil pressure is below 30 PSI, I want to be able to see how far I drove, and the amount of time I was at that. Typically, I would actually have this set at 20 PSI because, but for the purposes of demonstration, I wanted to be able to show you something here. So the first thing we're going to look at is the sensors that come, without the need for math channels. And I think that, we've got RPMs, we've got oil pressure and water temperature. So we can see minimum, average, maximum. Interesting to see the progression of the engine temperature. No radiator fans on Formula Fords, and so, well, the Formula Ford that I have. So it's interesting to keep a monitoring of what the average water temperature is to make sure you've got engine health that is there, and looking through that. And is your average, is it spiking a lot in terms of max, which is nice to have a look at. Nothing too untoward that is there. Same thing with oil pressure. It's relatively okay in terms of, it's relatively consistent in terms of the average that is there. But I have got some minimums which I've set a trigger on. And I'm going to scroll over to the right, and I want to have a look at a couple of things, which will then allow me to do a little bit more analysis. So the first is have I dropped below the minimum oil pressure trigger, and how much did I drive on that particular low oil pressure? So here you can see I drove 1.3 seconds below the target that I wanted, or 154.2 feet that I actually drove. Now, this is useful if you really do have a low oil pressure warning that you want to be able to have it trigger under 20 PSI, because then you can go in and look at some additional information, and I'll show a little bit of what that looks like. But the one I wanted to have a look at today for Formula Ford was the RPMs, because this one is something that I do want to address, and something that you'll see how I want to be able to address it. So you'll notice that I put a trigger in here that said anything that goes above 7,000 RPM, I want to not only know about it, but I want to know how many seconds I was above that RPM threshold and how far I drove in that instance. And you can see that this is where, you know, the numbers start to creep up. You know, there's one down here, you know, 5.4 seconds, 4.5. And you can look at this in two ways. So the first thing is, you know, is it a case of, you know, the gearing on the long straightaways is triggering the car into the highest RPMs? And do we want to have a gearing? Or is this something that the driver is doing, as in, is there something that I am doing that I can remedy and fix so I don't blow an engine to pieces? Which I have done. Not, yeah, anyway, different story. You know, when you race for a decade, you do make mistakes. I'm sure we've all experienced something or another. You know, as we look at, you know, this, we can see that, okay, I want to address some of these sort of variables. Now, what I've done here is I've created a max RPM analysis. So I'm actually going to trigger that one, and I'm going to load that up because I want to be able to see, is it driver or is it potentially gearing, taking that rev over a certain threshold. So I'm going to get rid, well, in fact, before I do that, I'm going to get rid of the lovely luminous green. Hold on a second. Just change that to a green here. And this slide's a bit busy, so you may want to be able to change it and have a look elsewhere. And first thing is, you can see that my sampling rate's a little bit all over the place. Got to fix this one, but we'll do that next time. And again, learning experience in terms of installation, in terms of, you know, the amount of sampling that we're getting. But at the same time, what you can see here is I've got a point, and this is a math channel that I've created that says, create a trigger every time you go over 7,000 RPM. The reason I've got this here and this here is I can see where that's happening. So this is happening here, and it's happening consistently here at this particular corner on the track. I can zoom in and show you where that is. So the nice thing is being able to see where it's happening. Now the next question is well, hold on a second. I'm not sure if that's a gearing issue anymore in terms of the revs hitting over a certain threshold. It looks probably driver. And so what I've also got is a calculated gear that says that I'm in second gear, and this is the second to third gear shift that is there. And so I'm just letting the engine rev out too much in this particular point on track. Now it's interesting to understand, how do I want to change that? Do I want a short shift here? Do I want to carry it through in third? Because the other thing is that I'm a little bit busy at this point as well, because I'm also turning. And the last thing you want as you're inducing quite a lot of G-force is to then take your hand off the wheel, reach over to be able to grab the gear change and be able to make sure you put it in the right gear. Because I'm sure some of you may at times have over-revved your car, and sometimes that's due to the fact that body position's in a slightly different place, and that third to fourth gear change is actually third to second, which sometimes is an ouch. And interestingly enough, the Jonathan Goring RPM analysis shows, you know, where an over rev happens, and looking at some of the diagnosis as to why it happened, and that's there. So it's interesting to see. This, again, would be a decision that I would have to make as to what I want to do. Now, what's interesting is that I only have the over rev at 7,500 RPM. And so, you know, I'm not, or maybe a little bit higher, I'm not sure. And so right now, I probably wouldn't look at this because I'm not really spending the time to go into the detail of engine health at that point, because the over rev light didn't come on. And so I've got two choices that are here. I can change my over rev light to be able to make sure I'm aware. I can adjust how I drive in terms of this corner. Now, interestingly, you may all have watched Roger's seminar in terms of his 20-minute data analysis, which actually interestingly used some of my data from Oregon Raceway Park. And he noted that I made a shift in an unusual spot. And the reason I made that shift is it was a very hard left-hand turn where I wanted a short shift before I went through a very high G-force turn that then carried me all the way up to a hill. So I made a conscious choice at that point to change the way I drove up that particular hill, rather than letting it go all the way to the top of the revs, change gear, all the way to the top of revs and change gear. So this is a driver input decision that I want to be able to make, because I want to fix this, because if I don't think this is very healthy. And I think, you know, at the time, you know, you'd want to be able to adjust this. So this is where we get into the final sort of phase of looking at what do we want to do. And that's where we get into a few last key characters of setup. So this is my Evo 4S. It's in my configuration setup. This is what I have. This is not my Evo 4S. This is my GS Dash, which is attached to the Evo 4S. And this is the first thing I can do, is I can actually go in and I can say, okay, well, I want to be able to make some decisions here. I want to change the shift lights to be able to make sure that I'm not over revving or getting close to that. So, and it's an easy fix to be able to do. You change this in your hotel room at night, you get to the track, you plug your car in, you hit transmit, and there you go. You've got your adjustment, which is the visual prompter that you have to be able to work through those particular variables that are there, which I think is very important to be able to have a look at. So that just gives you an idea of something that you may want to change from a driver point of view, to be able to say, okay, this will change some of the variables that I've learned from the engine analysis that I've done the night before, the morning before. And remember, if you've got 2 hours between sessions at the track, by all means, spend that time looking at data. The challenge that you have there is that there's always so much distraction, like watching another race or bench racing with your friends, or actually repairing and working on your car, or prepping it, changing tires, doing whatever need be. This is nice to be able to do when you've got a bit of time, you've got your beer in your hand, and you're really taking the time to be able to work through those variables. The last thing you may also want to be able to do here is to be able to, you know, change some of the message. So I actually have a nice little purple light that comes up with an over rev that just reminds me, and it doesn't go away until I've downloaded the data. And I've done this on purpose to be able to have a constant reminder in the car to be able to say, remember what you're doing and don't do it again. Which again is something that, you know, is how you determine what you want to be able to do with your own driver prompts as you're driving around the track. Because remember, you're busy anyway. So the beauty of having a setup with colored lights is that you can actually remember what's going on. Now, you know, it's important to remember what the lights mean, and interestingly, you can activate the simulation if anyone's actually interested. These are the two that I really pay attention to, and this is almost like an instant stop, so to speak, in terms of your water temperature's gone off the charts or your oil pressure's dropped next to nothing. That is like, pay attention right now. Whereas this one is an over rev, don't do it again, and this is a voltage indicator. Again, different things that you can look at as you go forward, but you know, all of these things combined together give you your manual for what you want to be able to do. And so just as a sort of a quick recap, as we sort of close out my part of this, you know, this session, is the first is, you know, when you're looking at driver consistency, split times, understanding what you're doing in segments, looking at line, looking at driver inputs. When you're looking against another competitor, I didn't do it because we're short on time, but a split time analysis on that is also the best thing to do, because just as Roger identified, by looking at their data and your data, they're doing something well somewhere, you're doing something well elsewhere. A split time will allow you to be able to identify that and pick out what they're doing and try and replicate that on track with the driver inputs. And then the final thing is to be able to say, okay, let's make sure that my setup in the car, which is what I have to be able to remind me what I'm supposed to be doing, is configured in the right way to be able to ensure that I tried desperately hard not to replicate what might have been arguably damaging the engine, or you know, the other thing which is interesting, even if you don't, you know, consider that to be engine damage, the general school of thought, and this is important to know in terms of your power curve, is that anything over 6,800 RPM in a Formula Ford engine is nothing. There's nothing, that's just noise. It's gone. You're out of the top curve, you're on the power band. Don't go above that. You got no power. And so it's one of those things to be able to think through, which may also indicate some of these things. And so with that, Roger, I'll stop sharing and hand it back to you for their close.
Perfect. There's a couple things that I'll, as I go back to the presentation materials, but the very, very interesting that boom, let's jump into that one. Very, 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 very cool that you went over some things, and you've used some fundamentals that I think are important. You know what happened Where did it happen? Why did it happen? You followed that same path virtually on everything that you were just talking about, and I think that's just wonderful. One of the I just want to reiterate a little bit. Michael had a question there. You're talking about a car without a rev limiter. That is true. In this particular case, he does not have a rev limiter on that car, so it's one of those things that he really wants to keep an eye on. That the car does not have an ECU and a rev limiter, so he needs to keep up on that. James, if you look over a couple of those questions, I'm going to go ahead and jump back in and jump to the next slide, and we'll hit those maybe a couple more questions as we're on our way out. This video will be number 101 up on our YouTube e-training video site. We have a bunch of videos up there. Obviously, they're all of these webinars, plus a whole bunch of other ones as well. A bunch of them that James helped us work with. So go visit some of those. I appreciate that. Again, in the description box of that, if you take a look at it, we always kind of put a little bit of an idea of what's in the webinar, and then down below that there's a show more button, and if you click on that, eventually in the next before the end of the day, typically we'll have the data, the math channels, and the profiles will all be there available for you, and this presentation in this case, because James added some pretty cool slides that you might want to review, so the presentation will be there available for you as well. We're a customer support company that helps work on these things. If you have any questions about what some of the stuff that we're seeing, or any other questions, give us a holler. Look for us at the track. Look forward to that. Here's kind of a cool one. What's our next webinar? Something that a lot of people have been working with. A lot of people have had some pretty cool questions. On Tuesday, July 28th, we're going to revisit Race Studio 3 analysis. A lot of you have been working with the public beta, and tons of questions have come in, and of course we're resolving a lot of those. But we promised that we were going to have every 2-3 weeks, maybe every month, depending on when we had the content to be able to do this, and when we were ready to announce some new features or answer some questions that we're hearing a lot, we would do it. And next Tuesday we're going to have Emiliano back here again from Italy, the software head of the software team, and he's gonna present some more information and some more functionality of Race Studio 3 analysis, the public beta, and of course take questions and hopefully give some answers on that as well. So please put that one on your schedule, that we're looking forward to chatting about that. The last screen I'm going to put up, but we're going to jump back to the Q&A here if James has a couple of quick answers. Here's our contact information. If you have any questions of anything that we've covered today that we didn't get to you about, James, you see any questions and answers there that kind of fit in with your presentation?
I actually think that there are a few. The first one I like is, how can I identify if the tires are not working properly, or if it's just a problem with the driver and it's not using 100% performance of the car?
That's a deep question.
I think this could actually be a really good session. But there's a few things that we can look at here. The one that I've been working on, and it's a development for me, is understanding something called GSUM, which I think is a great indicator of how much you're using of the car and whether you're using its maximum. There's other variables which I've seen and experienced, which is sometimes you can look at steering angle in the car, and you can look at latitudinal, and you can see where the driver is turning the wheel and the car might be understeering, or the car might be oversteering and the driver is correcting with the steering wheel. So that might be interesting to be able to look at, that the tire conditions have got slippery, and all of a sudden there's a lot more correction that is being made by the driver by nature of how their driver inputs are responding to lateral input. So I think that would actually make a good seminar in the future, because tire performance is a fascinating one that has track conditions. Yeah. But as you do that, the most important thing here to be able to note, and the best thing to play with on this one is iRacing. In iRacing, you can change track conditions through the day of exactly the same track, and you can look at what happens to driver inputs in terms of steering and performance. So that might be a fun one to have a look at as well. But I'd say there's a few ways to be able to look through that sort of aspect of looking at it. Is the car or the driver, or what's not working on that?
Yeah,
I think perfect. That was. Why don't you put GSUM and GVS on the graph? I think that was at the time. I have that. I have it in different graphs that I use, and it's just a question of user preference and working through it. But I do often use both of those as well. And GSUM is something that up until we started these seminars, I barely even looked at, but I think is probably one of the things that I'm learning most about as we go through.
And different folks, when you're looking at data, different, you personally sometimes having those channels merged together, like David mentioned, is very powerful. Sometimes other users, other folks that are running their analysis, they want to see them split apart. So a lot of people, I think, both Jeremy, Lucas, and Matt and Peter have all showed that particular one, and they show that together, and there's a reason that they like to see that. It helps line up some information about where in the GSUM that you have some problems. So maybe something we'll dig into a little bit deeper as well. Again, I appreciate everybody being here. The questions and answers that we just went through, some of them, there were some that were answered by our fantastic AIM staff that were working in the background. The questions and answers, within about 2 or 3 days, we have to compile them and format them and get them ready. They will also be linked in the description box for every, if you go back and look at other videos, you'll find the questions and answers will be attached in there as well. So the questions and answers that we just discussed will be placed in the description for this one later on as well. I appreciate everybody being here. I seen Cindy Lux posted that she's watching these, probably a friend of James as well, another Pacific Northwest driver. Thanks for being here, Cindy. Thanks for thanking us. And I appreciate all of you being here. Again, looking forward to the next one next Tuesday with Emiliano and talking more about Race Studio 3 Beta. Some pretty cool things. One of the things that James went out of his way to do is go out to Google Earth. That's built into Race Studio 3 Beta, which is going to be something that'll be kind of cool for us to work with as well. So I appreciate everybody being here. Look forward to seeing you all in the next one, and see you on Tuesday.